Yes, hello, welcome back. And I'm really happy to introduce you the last speaker of today of Miss Audio Day 2. She's Korinna Hennig. Is a German journalist, and she's the host of the most successful podcast in the country since February. That's Coronavirus Update. And that's Coronavirus Update features interview with the virologist Professor Dr. Christian Dorsten. And here is Korinna to tell us more about this success and how this podcast is helping fighting misinformation in Germany. Welcome, Korinna.
Well, it's not a quick dialogue. There are long passages where the expert may explain thoroughly, sometimes without me interrupting him frequently or her frequently. And the idea in the beginning was quite different. If you change to the next slide, then you would see a little about how it all began. There are some keywords. We have an audio lab in NDR, North German radio station where I work, which is sort of a think tank developing new formats on the radio and thinking about the future of radio and of podcasts. And the head of this think tank, Norbert Grundei, had the idea. We were then talking about like 10 to 15 minutes every day, which is a fact about we must laugh about now, because everyone who has ever listened to this podcast learns very quickly that it's almost impossible in this situation, in this format, with these experts to talk like 10 minutes about a complex situation. So we do it in a lot of different way now, which I will tell you further on. We knew then that Christian Dorsten is the leading virologist in Germany on coronaviruses and especially on SARS. He already played a major role in the SARS-1 epidemic. And we also knew that he's a scientist who's very keen on sharing his knowledge with the public, not only with the scientific community, who especially in times of crisis does this. For example, he published the genome sequences he had found out as soon as he had them early this year and communicated this on Twitter. So Norbert asked him if he would agree to do this podcast with us, because we thought there might be a need for more information, that there might be too little information in the media, including the NDR, because we didn't always have enough time, enough space to inform thoroughly about what's happening there. And the first surprise in the story is that he said yes almost immediately. He said, well, I agree, we can start tomorrow. And because he's a very important person in virology and in this crisis, we had hardly expected that. So it took us like 1 to 2 days to organize everything, make sure the podcast would get attention, which is sort of a political question, of course, to get on stage at iTunes and Spotify and everything, to do the cover layout and provide Christian Dorsten with the technical stuff, because he is in Berlin, I'm in Hamburg, and we are connected via an app. We don't see each other while talking. We only hear each other, which means that sometimes there's a little delay when we react to one to another. And at the end of February, the timing for a podcast was occasionally perfect. Unfortunately perfect, because the night before we started the first episode, the first SARS-2 coronavirus cases emerged in Germany. Not really the first ones, but the first ones where you couldn't make out a direct connection to China. Because on the first cases in Munich, there was very quickly clear that there was a businesswoman from China traveling to the company in Munich. And but then when we started the podcast, there were more cases without any China connection. So we got all the attention we wanted. And I told you we wanted to talk like 10 minutes, but already on the first episode, it took us about 30 minutes. Although it was then quite a conventional interview, a journalistic interview. We had not prepared anything in special with Christian Dorsten. I just did my research and asked my question, and he was answering. And almost immediately, the news about the podcast spread all over Germany, which surprised us a lot, because obviously there had been a gap in the information landscape on the coronavirus. So now the content developed a lot from the beginning. The first 2 or 3 episodes, I think we were just talking very generally about viruses, about coronaviruses, about the little science knew by that moment about this special coronavirus. But then we began to look out for special subjects. So Christian Dorsten and now Sandra Zizek as well looks out for topics, for issues, and I and my co-editor do as well. We look out for subjects we believe people do not know enough about, like, for example, immunity. And what is even more important, we look out for issues where scientific research is making progress or where questions are coming up the science cannot answer yet, but where there's important discussion on immunity, I told you, on airborne infection, which is very, very important, of course, in this pandemic. And we have several sources. The main source, of course, are scientific studies, published one in journals and also preprints, not yet peer-reviewed preprints, which is where the scientists play a very important role, because even science journalists, even for science journalists, it's not very easy to sort them out, to find out if these are really good made studies. And there are questions the audience is encouraged to send us per email. And there are thousands of questions. Most of them we can't answer because they are political questions or because they do not fit into the special scientific portfolio of Christian Dorsten, of a virologist's knowledge. But there's quite an amount we can also discuss in the podcast. And sometimes we tackle fake news or things certain persons publish to play the whole cause down, to deny the danger of coronavirus, because this might be important in the communication. We do not do this very often, but we do, and we do not name these people. We just deal on the subject level with them. So both of us are contributing the content to the podcast. The scientists apparently a little more, since they are the ones to explain, to understand every detail of a study and its design. And they are the ones who could judge, as I mentioned, reliably the scientific research, if it's serious and if it's good. In a regular situation, this would be the background research effort we make as science journalists. Give a call to special scientists to ask them for their opinion. But this is now we do what we do in the podcast. And I do a lot of research by myself, of course, and even bring sources, studies into the dialogue by my own questions and issues. But we talk about that in advance to prepare a little. In generally, so we agree roughly about what we are talking about, so I can prepare to keep on understanding and co-thinking while the scientist is talking, and be able to transmit information to the laypersons among us. Although there are a lot of doctors and experts listening to us, but of course it's often important to translate a little the words the scientists use in there. So mostly we do not give straight answers, and this is what is special about the podcast. We serve a background on the pandemic, and very often it gets quite complicated, quite complex. For example, Christian Dorsten twice reported about virus evolution. This was somewhat like a lecture in a university class because it was full of technical terms. I often try to translate, and Christian Dorsten as well is very good at finding metaphors, explaining vividly, illustrate the facts. But still, as we do not want to simplify, it remains complicated very often. And this is the big surprise we get. People obviously appreciate it. So if you go into the next slide, at this point, I will tell you what reception is on and what the success is made of. Because this makes the whole story of the podcast really astonishing. Very soon from the beginning, the numbers of listeners climbed into spheres we would never have dreamt of. We now almost have reached 70 million streams and downloads. This is not every person counted, but every stream and download counted, which makes me still freezing. It's unbelievable for us. So far, we have published 61 episodes. The latest one was yesterday. And please keep in mind, we started with episodes of 30 minutes of duration. But nowadays, we do not publish the podcast daily anymore, but weekly. And now the episodes tend to be like 60 minutes once, or once after a summer break. It was even more than 100 minutes. So that is quite a bit of pure science. But people keep listening. Of course, the numbers slowed down a little during the summer when everything was a little easier, when the infection rate was going down. But we get a lot of response at all. And this is really unusual because people send us emails just to say thank you, not only to send us questions, to say thank you that we don't do easy answers in this podcast. And they keep telling us, for example, I'm really concerned. Sometimes I'm even scared by the pandemic, but listening to this podcast calms me down. It enables me to make my own decisions on the base of some background knowledge I get from Christian Dorsten. So this is really seldom, and this is surprising for me as well, because people normally in normal situations tend to send emails or call just when they want to criticize anything or even to insult us, because that's something every journalist knows in these times, I think. But this is just the other way around. We get some critics, of course, as well, but the overwhelming amount of feedback is positive feedback. And what also surprises us is that people keep on listening through the whole episode. I told you that the episodes got longer over the time, but you can tell from numbers some podcast platforms publish that the majority of the audience is staying until the very end. Like 80% of our listeners obviously listen to the whole episode. Of course, our listeners, our audience are mainly people with higher education, but not exclusively. We have doctors, but we have also janitors listening to us, and they come from all ages, because on one occasion in the podcast, I presented an email from a mother telling me that her, I think, 10-year-old daughter is listening to the podcasts. And we have podcast listeners who are quite old, which is unusual for podcasts, as we all know. And then it was sort of a competence between our listeners to send us emails. Well, my 8-year-old son also listens, and I'm 88 years old, and I also listen to the podcast. So it's like people from 8 to 80 roughly said, and sending us emails as well. And nowadays it's like 100, 250 emails. Getting more these days again, but on the peak of the pandemic, we had like 2,000 emails just on one day. I told you there are a lot of questions we cannot answer, but politics does not either. And although Germany seems to manage the crisis quite well, and so I think what is really important that we are talking about open questions and doubts in science. But of course, this is not without any problems. So if you go on to the next slide, I will tell you a little about what this is about. Sometimes we have conflicts with colleagues, with other journalists, especially from social media, although they try to do their very best. But we frequently have to argue with other journalists, even from our own broadcasting company, because they take out small pieces as they need for Facebook or Twitter or what else there is, or for YouTube. And they take them out sometimes from complex explanations, and by that distort them. This is really difficult, especially for Christian Drosten, because sometimes it's about, if you say, for example, there was a huge argument about the role of children in the pandemic, and Christian Drosten presented a study with the conclusion children may be as infectious as adults. And some people took out this piece and changed it into children are as infectious as adults, which is not true, because the science did not know at that moment. And especially now it seems to be that they play a minor role, but still they play a role in the pandemic. So this is a little detail, but it is important. And I don't think that this distortion happens on purpose, but we all know that journalists do not have enough time for research these days. They do not know enough because they all have a huge workload and we don't have enough people. So, and sometimes, I'm sorry to say that rude way, there are also people who are too lazy to do a deep dive into the whole thing, because this is exhausting. I think quite often there's very little conscious of what we all are doing there. So, and as a conclusion, unfortunately, science is just the opposite of what tabloid press does, for example. The one excludes the other in the main parts. So there's very scarcely news. In the corona pandemic, you can press into a headline. So far, wait for the vaccine. Maybe it's better then. And also politicians often don't want to take responsibility retrospectively. And some media have political driven agendas in Germany. So Christian Dorsten suffered a lot from attacks on his person. There were people who, and indirectly also politicians, who held him responsible for what politics decided on the basis of his expertise, although he is not the one to make decisions. And his expertise is only a special part of the whole thing you have to keep in mind to make political decisions. And Christian Dorsten is the most exposed virologist in this pandemic in Germany, I think partly even because of the podcasts. And of course, as I mentioned, we sometimes have to deal with fake news and conspiracy theories by people who misused publishing platforms of our own podcasts for their own agenda, sometimes even for financial reasons, to sell products, and they just wanted to draw attention to their websites. But these conflicts, especially when you contrast them with what we get as a response from our audience, who testify the complete opposite, who appreciate everything we do, this confirms us in what we are doing. So on to the last slide. Here are the learnings from the whole story of surprise. I believe as journalists, we should not underestimate our audience. A lot of them obviously are willing to listen to things that are not simplified, not downsized, especially when they are important. As a science journalist, and my colleagues would all confirm that, I'm used to editorial conferences where the colleagues say, well, this is too complex, this is too complicated, where's the relevance? People won't understand this. But now in this situation with this podcast, we see, yes, there is a way if we make the effort to explain things. And of course, if people are really interested, I must admit this is a special situation. This is the only restriction to our story of surprise and our encouraging stories. A situation of general concern, we don't have this very often, but I might add, might not the climate change be a crisis of general concern as well, where science journalists might fit in? What I learned is we should refrain from suggesting answers too fast where there are no answers yet, because open questions might be information too. And clarification and enlightenment is important in a crisis situation like this, even and especially when there are no final answers. So what I learned is communicate about doubts, talk about limitations, about study designs, which is what Christian Dorsten does very often, even talking about his own limitations in his knowledge. Explain how scientific studies are made and where the design of a study may generate some question marks to it. People are very willing to learn and then think by themselves. So a podcast like this, I think, improves what in Germany we call scientific literacy. What pleases me a lot as a radio journalist, obviously radio, obviously audio, in this special case podcast, is a medium that is especially suitable for complex items like science. Reading a long and complicated text in the newspaper requires much more personal effort than listening to a competent person who explains these things in spoken language. It's like sitting with someone at the kitchen table, and or listening to a very good made lecture. So finally, I suggest, as a journalistic learning in a crisis like this, it might be a good way to form a temporary alliance between journalism and scientific experts. Yes, we need to be independent and critical, but if the limitations of knowledge and expertise are communicated frequently, there's no need to push a controversy just to prove you are independent as a journalist, because we still are. But we need the expertise of scientists. And the flood of information these days is far beyond from what single journalists, even really good science journalists, can cite and judge, especially when we talk about preprint studies that are not peer-reviewed yet. But of course, it's important to hear a huge amount of experts, not to only concentrate on one expert. What we in this podcast do on it's 2 experts, but of course in our research, before we look out for different opinions, although opinion is a very difficult thing on science. But talking about limitations, I think does a lot to that as well. But keep in mind, sometimes people only read the headlines. So when you take out small pieces as a journalist, we have to work even more thoroughly than with the big pieces, or at least with higher attention. We have to be very alert. We have to keep in mind, don't simplify it where you can't. Thank you very much. So this is what, for my part, maybe there are any questions.
Hi, Korinna. Thank you. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I really like it. And we have a question from Corinne Potja. Corinne is asking, is NDR doing or planning to do anything to specifically target the children's podcast market? It's taking off in Australia and the US.
Oh, I appreciate this question a lot, because I would love to do it. While doing this podcast, I sometimes had contact with teachers, and I was doing this as on special occasions for classes for schools, and for our children's program at NDR, which is also have a podcast. We had some special editions, of course, with me, and then a very huge one with Dorsten. I really would love to do it. Unfortunately, I can't say that NDR is planning this, because as everyone, we have too little people there. And at the moment we can't, but I keep this in mind, because I think science for children is interesting, is important, and I think children would appreciate this a lot. And my closest colleague who's working with me on the podcast, who normally is not a science journalist, but got into that role in the pandemic somehow, who's my co-editor, Katharina Mahnholz, is also the responsible person for the children program at NDR. So we're on it, and I promise we do our very best to make that happen.
That's good to know. We have a question from Lee Sejong from Singapore. Lee asks, were there interesting insights on how the podcast became so popular? Also, whether different formats were explored besides interviews? Were there another format used for the coronavirus update, or just interviews?
Yeah, no, we don't have other formats, because it's we don't have the capacity to do this. What we sometimes do is have additional experts in the podcast. For example, yesterday we had a doctor, a leading leading doctor from a hospital in Hamburg. But what we do is we have another science podcast, which is not only on the coronavirus, but another podcast. And this is like somehow a narrated research. There are 2 journalists talking, and one of them is a science journalist. Different science journalists are coming up to the show, reporting on things, bringing telling the story behind the headlines, how they come to their information, for example, on very different issues. But I think, as you asked for the success of the podcast, it has to do a lot with Dorsten, because he is a very special way to talk about what he's doing there. And this is what people keep telling us, that they like him very much. They like his way to do. But we're trying to learn from that to transfer it to other formats, of course.
We have another question from Ana Salinas. Ana said, great presentation. Do you use the feedback, the questions you receive from the audience, to identify potential topics for the podcast?
Yes, of course we do that, because we have colleagues who work on this, who answer every email they can, and they just sum up the questions we get. And so it's not only, some people keep asking about what shall I do because I'm thinking about the vaccine, what shall I do when I go on for a journey or whatever, very special questions, but we also have these background questions. And so we identify where there is more information needed on which huge amount, on which issues, for example. And sometimes the audience even comes up with links to studies by themselves, which is quite interesting, because by that we see that a lot of people are currently reading studies on preprint servers, which is quite good, but also a little dangerous because there are a lot of studies badly made. So where the study design can't answer any questions, but they're supposed to answer questions. And so we try to manage this a little to help the people learn reading these studies. And of course, this is an important source for us.
I have a question also myself, Korinna. So, I mean, you said that, Christian Dorsten is one of the most important virologists in Germany. And thanks to this podcast, journalism and science are together. That is super important. And my question is, there are another scientists in Germany that, thanks to listening to this podcast, they are contributing with their papers, or they want you to talk specifically about something that maybe is important regarding the virus or another illnesses?
Yeah, I think this is happening indirectly because the virologists working on the coronavirus, doing research on that, have quite a network. They keep talking, they keep calling each other, not only to have an exchange, but also to explain one the other special features, because everyone has this very special portfolio, of course, and a special expertise. So they are in contact all the time. Apparently, which is quite surprising, there are no virologists calling us to say, you have to talk about this. But sometimes, of course, they contribute content. And this is also something that's developing during the time. For example, yesterday, in our episode we did yesterday with Sandra Zizek, with the other virologist, she called up a colleague in advance to ask her to make some modeling study piece, especially for the podcast. So she was calculating something for us we could then publish in the podcast, which was not in her study. That was interesting. And we also asked an expert, a physician, on these modeling studies to help us with the research. And then he did. And of course, we by ourselves then decided what we took out. But so this is getting huge and more huge every time. And there's a community. And I think this is a very, very good development.
Indeed, there is a very good development. And we have one more question. Colm on Mongain ask, how many dedicated people are on your team?
I feel a little ashamed to say this because the team is very, very small. The NDR was sometimes communicating that there are like 10 people working on the podcast, which of course was true, but it was not working on the podcast, but working on everything that's around it. So dealing with the huge amount of feedback we get, answering emails, everything that's on that. And of course, some technical support we had, and we had persons who were continually for developing what we had to do. Like we present a script to the podcast, of course, as well, so you could read it out again afterwards. But our team, the closest one, is very small. In the beginning, we were like 2 persons, me and my co-editor and producer, Katharina Mahnholz, who started the whole thing with me. Then I had a co-host, my colleague Anja Martini, who was doing, I think it's like 12 or 13 episodes, and when I'm on holiday, of course, she's doing it again. But because we have a lot of normal, regular work to do in our program for science, we had to divide this again. So she is doing that now because it was getting too much for us. And then I have a colleague who's not based in Hamburg, who's working as a freelancer, who does a lot of research for me now, who's now moving to Hamburg. I'm very glad to have her there because she's a science journalist and she's very helpful. But mainly that's it.
Good. Great to hear, Korinna. And thank you so much for your time today, for your great presentation.